We're moving on to the front end of the bike. There's a lot to do on the front end. So I've got the whole lighting package, headlight, high beam, parking light, turn signals, and then the dashboard, which is the most intensive portion of the whole build. So what you see here is actually part of the brand new wiring harness. In what was certainly one of the more stressful events, I took the new wiring harness that I bought that didn't fit and tore it apart and cut out what I wanted. Maybe not the most efficient way to use a $300 wiring harness, but I didn't want to reuse the old because some of the connections were a little hinky. But you can see here that I've got everything I need. So we should have, that should be the two turn signals, the parking light, which can go right to the ignition switch, probably through a spade connector. We've also got the dashboard lights. No, I'm sorry, the clock and speedo light. That'll just tie into the light circuit. Yellow with black. What is that? Not sure. I'll have to pin that out. Basically we have left turn signal, right turn signal, parking light, the speedo, and this is probably the voltage regulator, voltmeter, which I think I'll wire a little bit differently. So I'm going to use a 6-pin connector to make these connections, and then I'll run that back to the main box. And then the only thing I'll have left after that are the dashboard and the two most critical components, the voltage regulator, the charging system, and the ignition system, which on paper are just really about 1 or 2 connections each. But I'm not 100% sure exactly how that's going to work. Oh, I also have the oil pressure switch and the neutral switch. I also could not find the diodes that I needed to run the indicator lamps, so for now I will just run one wire, so we'll only get an indication on the left or the right turn signal, but I'll figure out where to buy diodes and add those later. So that's where I'm headed next. Alright, another quick update on the wiring. After spending a little bit of time looking at it, what I've decided to do is change the connectors around. And this has to do with where everything's being wired. I put the headlight on its own connector because the way it's wired into the headlight bucket, if I didn't do that, I'd have no way to unwire it if I ever needed to in the future. Then what I realized was that some of the items here that I had on the dashboard wiring circuit actually can be wired separately through the front wiring harness that includes the turn signals and the parking light. So I took these off connector 3 and added a new connector 6, and then I put these on connector 3, which removes at least 3 connections from connector 4, which will, instead of having to use 2 8-pin connectors, I think I can use 1 8-pin connector. So I'll have to update all that in my documentation, but I think that'll be a better plan. So here's one of those handy tips you only figure out about halfway through a job after your fingers are raw. And if you install these grommets on before you strip the wire, then you don't fight the plugs, or you don't fight the stranded wires getting caught in there, and you have fewer stranded wires poking you in the finger. Much easier. I'm sure that's obvious to many people out there, and it only took me about 20-30 connections before I finally caught on myself. So there you go. Piece of cake. Alright, well, it's been a hell of a day. It's about 10:30 at night. Started this morning at about 6 a.m. Took a break here and there, but been at it most of the day. You can see I've left a little bit of a mess. I did rewrite my wire list. I had to make several changes to it hopefully for the better. And I tell you, at this point, it's definitely been a productive day, but certainly a little overwhelming. The rear's hooked up, a lot of the front's hooked up, and right now it sure looks like a mess. And you can see that I got a lot of work to do to clean this up, and I'm not really sure how I'm going to do that yet, so that will remain to be seen. Got several plugs made up. I've made most of the changes I made were related to how I was working up here in the headlight area. So these are the clock and voltmeter lights, which I ended up powering off of the same low beam light circuit, so they'll all come on at the same time. I combined those grounds heading back. I don't think that'll be an issue. I've got the parking light hooked up to the ignition switch and then grounded through the headlight circuit. The ignition switch is set up. It's working for powering the bike on, and the parking light switch, and I think that's all I'm going to be doing with that. I've got another line here that will run the clock. Now, the BMW analog clock is a heck of a battery drain, so we will see if that remains, but I've got a provision to hook it up. Temporarily, I've got the gauge cluster in here so I can see how the cables run, and that's where I'll pick off tomorrow. This is the wire cluster for the gauge pack, and this is the most connectors in one plug. I've got it at 8. My biggest connector is 8, so I'm perfectly balanced, and I'm out of connectors, so if I discover any more, I'll have to scare up some more connectors, but I think I'm okay. Anyhow, definitely a very productive day. Like I say, cleaning this up will be the biggest challenge. I'm a little concerned I probably cut this wire pack a little too short, so I may have to get a little creative on how I run that. But, oops. I may have cut this wire pack here a little too short. This is the first thing I did, actually. These are the inputs off the left switch. It all reaches, but I may have to wire it a little differently, or I may have to route it a little differently. A little concerned about running signal wires right at the coils, but I don't know if that'll have an impact or not. It's just grounding the connections. It's not like it's passing a serial communications circuit or something. I've also got several different ground points that I need to figure out how to tie in to good earth grounds. And the one circuit that that's got the most tie-in points is the running lights, because it's the rear lights, running lights, the front headlight, the speedometer lights, the clock, and voltmeter lights. So there's a lot of stuff going off that one circuit, and I got to figure out how to tie that together without being too ugly. I do have some spade connectors in here, which I don't like, but they are soldered, so they should be reliable connections. And then the last piece of the puzzle I'll obviously need to figure out is how exactly to hook up to the coils and to the generator. Generator looks pretty easy. Coils should be one more connection, but we shall see. So, very productive day. Still 2 more days left in this long weekend, and I don't see any reason why I can't get the wiring terminated, if not cleaned up and pretty. Of course, a lot of this stuff up here is not going to get pretty until the painted parts come back, so that will remain a mess for some time to come. Okay, I'm going to take a nap. So in this bucket, initially there was all the wires were connected, so that this board was back here and all the wires were connected in there, and as a result there's a lot of depth here. Looks like, I don't know, 6 inches or better. The downside with the LED headlight bulbs is that they do have a nice pigtail that plugs directly into this harness, which is great, but they do have some depth on them, and they do have some heat rejection requirements. I think there's enough depth in this bucket. The replacement LED bulb just for the standard is about $35, or maybe $35 to $50. You can also get entire replacements that include the lens and everything, but those are $400 or $500. I'm not ready to do that. So I'm going to get those bulbs on order. I also have not yet found these folks, which are the instrument cluster lights, but I'll do a little more research on that. And once I get them in, I will show you. The nice part is, what I was getting to was that the bike computer here, hidden behind the rat's nest of wires, it already supports LED bulbs. So one of the things you'll find is that when you replace an LED bulb using standard relays, turning signals, they have a capacitor in there, and if you don't have enough load on the bulb, you end up with the really quick flashing of the bulbs that you've seen. Well, this already has provision built in, and I assume that it's really just because there's a timer inside. It's not using an old like 555 style timing circuit. It's just using logic to time the bulb out. So you don't have to get any of those load devices that you add into an LED bulb when you replace an incandescent and you're still using the original OEM turn signal flasher. So another little bonus of the MotoGadget unit. Today, I'm going to get back to it. Today, I'm going to be wiring the instrument cluster. So this is the largest connector I'll be using. It's an 8-pin, which is exactly what I need. So I hope my calculations are right. I'll have to tee off a little bit. I'm going to be using a common cable, obviously, for the grounds. So I've only got one ground circuit there. Then both turn signal indicators. And then one of the things that's kind of interesting is the way this works is I need to provide power to the neutral indicator and oil switch. Then that's got to go back through the actual switches, which will frame ground. So I have to get not just a common ground. See, all the other loads are an input and a ground, an input and a ground. This one has a powered input, and then it will ground out through the actual switches, which are on the left side of the bike. So I'll have to wire to those. And then, of course, just a high beam indicator, which will come off the high beam line, and the lights. Actually, that's just, okay, so a little epiphany here. I don't have to bring the high beam through this plug connector because I've already got the high beam out on a separate cable. So what I can do then is tee off the high beam and power the indicator from there. Yeah, I don't have to run that through the plug. Okay, hey, thanks for helping me figure that out. All right, more to follow. All right, right now I'm trying to figure out the starter wiring. I haven't quite gotten it, but I think I'm getting pretty close. So it looks like I need to supply, this is wrong here, so I need to supply positive directly to the starter motor. I found that connection. And then there's a smaller cable that goes to the starter solenoid terminal. That's going to come off the M-Gadget unit. So these terminals here, I haven't figured out why there's two of them yet, but that would go wire from there around here to this terminal right there, which appears to be the starter solenoid terminal. Now there's already a terminal hooked into the diode board from there. I don't know if that's required or not. I'm just feeling my way through here. But I do know that the power lead comes off of this heavy duty cable there, and that's got to go directly to the battery. So I'm going to try to wire that in and see what happens. Alright, well, it's been 3 full days of working on the wiring on the motorcycle. I'll confess, I'm a little frustrated that it's not completely wired, but definitely have accomplished a lot. Definitely a couple things to work out, but moving in the right direction. So if we look, pretty well wired up. I spent some time getting the grounds wired all together. I spent some time getting the positives wired together. I've got the fuse in place now. If we take a look, I put the fuse inside the box over there on the left. I'm wired to the grounds and the positives are to the MotoGadget unit, and my inputs and outputs are relatively neat. The wiring's not neat, but I've got one wire per input and output, so that's nice and clean. Still have one jumper tying my positives together because I wasn't ready quite to put those in the battery, and I found a connector here. It's a 3/8 spade connector that I need to replace, so I need to find something for that. In testing, my clutch switch seemed to stop working. I need to track that down and figure out why the clutch is no longer in the circuit, because it was before. And odds are that probably means there's a ground somewhere. And then I realized that the kill switch was backwards, which doesn't seem to match the testing I had earlier. But in looking at the schematic, it looks like it could only be backwards. Basically, there's no connection when you go to the off position, so the only place it's going to be grounded would be in the on position. So I need to give that a little bit more thought. I have wiring to the starter motor and successfully made it make noise, but I don't know that it's correct. I need to look at how the diode board interacts with the new system. So definitely a lot of progress. There's three things. The three main things that still have to happen are the starter motor we need to figure out, the ignition coils, and the voltage regulator. Relatively few numbers of connections there, but obviously critical connections. So I'm going to make myself a list of questions, do some research, and I have a few hours in a couple days from now where I can spend a little bit of time on it, but after that it'll be a couple weeks. So sometimes walking away from a project gets you a little perspective. So that's what I'm going to do. So overall, good weekend. Wish I'd made it a little bit further, but accomplished a tremendous amount. And think everything's moving in the right direction. At least I have some confidence right now that one day this motorcycle could run again. So it's good. More to follow.